Hello, everyone. My name is Evelyn, and I'm here with Kathy Crawley Jones, an environmental justice lawyer, and we're going to talk about some topics on environmental justice and environmental racism. So, Kathy, would you like to introduce yourself? Or
Sure. My name's Kathy Crawley Jones. I was raised in San Angelo, Texas, and I'm a 1982 graduate of Texas Christian University. Go Frogs.
Frogs.
Uh, and since 1989, I have been licensed as an attorney. I started my practice in Austin, Texas, and had not planned to go into environmental law. Had thought that I was going to be a minister and then ended up meeting and marrying a minister. And so I thought, well, the next closest thing to a minister is a trial lawyer because they've got a point they're trying to get across. They've got a audience that they need to convince, and then you have evidence or scripture on which you base that argument. So a lot of parallels between litigators and preachers. Um, so I just started out, I'm a graduate from Vanderbilt Law and Divinity Schools. Um, and I started out as a litigator with a Dallas-based firm named Haynes and Boone. It was a large corporate firm, and we were hired by the Resolution Trust Corporation to help with disposition of the distressed assets of failed savings and loan. What a distressed asset is a piece of property that has environmental contamination. And at that time, in the early 90s, the laws had not been changed to provide for a exception for lenders to the Superfund laws. So at that time, if you were in the chain of title, you became jointly and severally liable, so completely liable for all of the environmental cleanup that needed to be done. So that really had an impact on banks who were trying to collect loans by foreclosing on property. And so the firm said, we need more people who understand environmental law. Is anybody interested? And I raised my hand and I said, here I am, send me. And went to my first continuing education course called Environmental Science for the Technically Challenged. Um, I, like all of my colleagues in that course, had a liberal arts background, not a science background, but I found it to be an area that I'm fascinated by. I've learned just enough to be able to communicate between experts and juries or fact finders and clients. And so I won't claim to be a scientist, but I appreciate scientific work, scientific method, and its impact in putting together solutions that work for everyone. Um, in 1996, we moved to North Carolina, and I and we were having our first child. And so I stayed home with her for a while, but then was really looking to see what I could do on a part-time basis to continue my law work, and had the opportunity to work with an attorney who had started out in personal injury work, and so was working what we call the plaintiff side of the docket. So representing individuals who had contaminated land, who were had contaminated water, had health impacts from those things. So I began to see the real impact of environmental mismanagement on people's lives. And so that really changed the course of the work that I've done and really enjoyed it. There's nothing like advocating for clean water and clean air and for being an advocate for people who may not have a voice otherwise.
Yeah, oh, exactly. I love to hear that. I love all the environmental stuff, so I'm like, yes. So just since you've worked in this field for so long, how would you define environmental racism, and how is that also legally defined when you're working in cases?
I think well, the term itself was actually coined by Ben Chivas,
Mm.
a North Carolina pastor.
Mm.
And it had to do with a decision we had, the science community had figured out that PCBs, polychlorinated biphenyls, were highly toxic. They had been used in widespread ways across industries, but particularly in electrical transformers as a way to um, insulate and allow for heat exchanges to happen. But so we had hundreds of thousands of transformers, electrical transformers across the country that were filled with PCB oil. And
Mm.
when we figured out that that was not a good thing to have everywhere in the environment, um, North Carolina had made a decision that they would be collected and then disposed of in Warren County, North Carolina, which is a
Mm.
highly uh, high percentage of African American and high percentage of low income families in that area.
Mhm.
And so there was a group of people, both community advocates, churches, and legal advocates who stood together to say this is not right. We should not, what we've already acknowledged is not good for all of us. We should not pretend that it's safe to dispose of in communities that are less likely to be able to organize, to oppose, or to resist that sort of thing. And so there there were bodies laid in the streets trying to keep
Oh my gosh.
the train loads of contaminants from coming into the county.
Mhm.
And that was where the term environmental racism was coined. And it
Mm.
has to do with um, communities of color and low income communities being asked and forced to bear the greater burden of environmental decisions that have been made um, over communities that are better resourced. And
Mm.
so multiple impacts from water impacts, soil impacts, low opportunity in terms of being able to move out and low opportunity to resist. And so the notion that, or what we found is the practice of low income and often BIPOC communities are more impacted by environmental waste and decisions that don't equitably spread the cost of those decisions across communities.
Mm. Yeah, and as I've researched and as I worked with this summer, as you know, I've worked with different communities like that all around the country, and it's a global issue, but especially in the United States, talking about, I mean, I worked in Commerce City in Colorado, right, and where they had oil refineries and major industries just dumping pollutants in their drinking water and in their soil. And you mentioned that they aren't able to move most of the time, and talking to people living in these communities, that's really is the case. There isn't the funding to move out of these neighborhoods, so they're stuck there, and then they're having to pay medical bills for all the illnesses that they are gaining from being around these pollutants. And so it's just it's there's a lot happening. And so moving on from that,
Can
so
the second part of your
oh
question
yes,
was whether or not
sorry.
that was embodied
Mhm.
in the law. And I will say, not to the extent that we think it should be.
Mhm.
There were a series of executive orders issued in prior administrations saying that we should consider disparate impacts on different communities. And under the Obama and Biden administrations, there were significant resources implemented for mapping
Mhm.
by census tracts, demographics, so that you could easily tell what the median income was, but you could also tell what health impacts were. You
Mhm.
could see, and some of the resources are still available. You could look by address how many children had asthma, what was the relative rate of cancer in that area versus the rest of the state. What was the median income? Those sorts of tools were out there so that you could make decisions and you could see really in very graphic terms what environmental racism looked like because you could compile that data and then you could also compile where these hazardous waste materials were. Um, and you could see how they were clustered and who was being more impacted. Unfortunately, in I believe it was March, an executive order was issued, and EPA rescinded prior orders. And in the executive order earlier this year, EPA was prohibited from considering any disparate impacts and prohibited from considering um, uh, how different communities are impacted. Um, so it's quite a step back in, and maybe I'm rambling too much, but
No, no, no.
I wanna um, highlight North Carolina because that's part of what I know is
Mhm.
that in 1998, I think it was, one of the first statutory laws trying to get to environmental racism was adopted as concerned the location of solid waste landfills.
Mm,
What that statute said was that if you are going to locate a landfill within a half mile of an existing landfill or within a mile of an existing landfill, and then the language was real specific, um, commissioners, is usually these decisions are made at the county
mhm,
level, but leaders shall consider what else is there, shall consider the demographics of the people being impacted,
mhm,
and shall consider alternatives to just locating another landfill where there already is one.
mhm,
And I was fortunate enough to be involved in litigation related to that law. It was the first time the law was tested to see what force, what teeth it really had. And we represented the citizens of Greene County who objected to the location of that landfill. The county was um, uh, lower income, and it was a the county was racially pretty equal, but
mhm,
the area that was going to be impacted was directly impacted was a higher minority area. So
mhm.
it was actually quite encouraging to see that both Black and white communities came together to oppose the landfill. There's part of me that believes that we were successful because it was a joint effort. I
Yeah.
don't know that the effort would have been as successful had the white community not gotten behind it, unfortunately. But it was a 4-year battle, and there were folks even in our churches who said, "Oh, it's a done deal. Why are you even wasting your breath?"
Mm,
And but 4-year battle, and the Court of Appeals held in our favor. The decision was returned to the county, and the county um, reversed their decision to approve the landfill. And there is not a regional landfill in Greene County. It had been designed to receive waste from New York City and from the
mm.
Northeast. It was designed to be as tall as the North Carolina
Oh
lighthouses.
my
It would
gosh.
have been the tallest structure in all of in all of Greene County. And so that's one thing. It's kind of fun to be able to point to and say it
Yeah.
worked. It worked, but it took a lot of fish fries, a lot of community
Mhm,
gatherings, and persistent effort not to give up, to challenge it, and then
mhm,
to prevail. So there's not a whole lot of laws out there that say
mhm.
thou shall consider or thou shall not do X if. Um, so really, it depends upon looking at uh, the Civil Rights Act and its
Mhm.
application, and whether or not you can make arguments that apply as well to environmental installations and what that disparate impact is. So it's kind of convoluted in terms of how we continue to try and achieve better equity and counteract environmental racism. But
I
it's there.
think I think it's so interesting hearing about how you guys put together this protest and the work you did towards it. It's tying in a lot with what we've been working on in class, talking about how protests are formed in different ways you can work towards a protest, that it's more than just when you think protest, it's more than just holding up signs and standing out. There's a lot that goes into it, and it happens over a really long span of time. In your case, it took 4 years, but we've talked about different protesting cases in this class that have gone on decades. And so thank you so much for providing that example as well. And I also wanted to go back to the one of the articles you sent me, which I will attach below the video, talking with having some interviews of community members talking about placing the landfill in there. And one that really resonated with me was one of the community members mentioned she was like, if there is such revenue coming out of these landfills, because they were using as an excuse that the landfill would provide revenue for these underfunded areas. If there's so much revenue coming out of there, why aren't they putting it in the richer, wider areas? Because then they can make the revenue. So just the excuses that people use to
Mhm.
argue like why this should be here, and that
Mhm.
also ties back into the place when I worked in Commerce City this summer as well, talking about how many of the people who lived in this underfunded community actually had to work at these factories because, or not the yeah, the factories, the oil refining factory and these industries, because they were what was convenient, what they could, if they didn't have cars, it was how they could get paid. But really, if it's such a money revenue, why are we putting, if it's such a money revenue, why are you trying to get rid of it, you know?
Right.
So I thought
On
that really resonated with me with the article you sent me.
to your point about the
Mhm.
importance of community
Yeah.
organization and persistence. Another example that comes to mind is the Atlantic Coast Pipeline. It was a
Mm,
pipeline that was proposed to go from the shale fields of Pennsylvania
mhm.
across Virginia, down through North
Oh,
Carolina
wow.
to the coast. Um, and it was approved, I think, in 2014. I hope I'm going to keep it was approved then. It was supposed to have been completed by 2019, 2020.
Mm,
Uh, but there were a lot of opponents to the pipeline uh, because of the expansion of fossil-based fuels, because of the environmental impacts
mhm,
of the pipeline itself. I mean, it's not, and it was a huge pipeline. It was a 48-inch pipeline. Um, it would be
mhm,
swaths of 100 feet um, going that entire length across
mhm,
the Blue Ridge Parkway, across Appalachian Trail,
mhm.
uh,
Oh,
across
wow.
just this priceless environmental resources. And so there was a network of people doing what they could where they were, whatever they could do to fight it. So
Mm,
there was a legal fight going on with challenging permits and whether or not all of the regulatory requirements had been met in the issuing of the permits. And then I got to be part of a group that, again, organized on the ground and
mm,
did so strategically. They were organizing protests. They were educating the community about what's coming through and organized with landowners across North Carolina route, at least one landowner in each county that the pipeline was going through to resist the eminent domain proceedings. Because, and you were talking about the role that money plays in
mm,
this, is that there's a lot of hype that typically surrounds a project like that where they say, oh, it's going to bring great revenue and
mhm.
great resources to the community. And so some folks were thinking, oh, we'll have access to natural gas. Well, no, they weren't going to have natural gas access because you don't have tapping points on a
Yeah.
48-inch line. That's just a transmission line. You're
Mhm,
not going to be able to do a service line out of that. You also had people who didn't feel like they could fight because of eminent domain.
mm,
In a situation like that, even though it's a private developer under the Natural Gas Act, they were given the power of eminent domain like they were the government. And
mm,
so they would come in and say, oh, we're just going to take it by eminent domain if you don't take our offer. And
mm,
they would give them money for farmland or for private land, but not anything like what it would be available for future development or preservation of resources, that sort of thing.
mhm.
And I could tell the story for a long time and I won't go into it all,
No,
but
you're all right.
between the Sierra Club and Southern Environmental Law Center and the kind of legal arm challenging the permits, they got everything slowed down. We were fighting the condemnation actions
Mm,
on the ground, and long story short, we had delayed the development enough, and then COVID came.
mm.
And I don't know if you remember, but during COVID, the price of a barrel of oil dropped to negative numbers.
Wow, yeah.
And so the economics didn't work anymore. And
Mm,
so I was on the cusp. Well, the other money piece of this is
mhm.
that the clients I was representing had promised that no amount of money was would make them settle the eminent
Yeah.
domain proceeding. And so my job was just to fight it as long as I could. And
Mm,
you don't win condemnation actions because it's always just about money and it's always
mm,
just about the quote fair market value. But I wasn't authorized to settle it. I wasn't authorized to hire experts that could do market valuations.
mm,
So I got to hire an expert who did environmental asset evaluations of the property to say what is it that this property contributes to cleaner air, to biodiversity, to um, uh, habitat, and try and put a different dollar figure on it. Um, but we were in the midst of COVID. We were having to deal with court by um, video because you
Oh, wow, yeah.
very few in-person hearings.
Mhm,
Um, and I had just lost my last motion to stay, and I was going to have to go to mediation, knowing
mm,
that I couldn't settle it. So I was about to have to waste a bunch of time doing what I knew
mhm,
I couldn't do. Um, and um, I think it was July 5th. It was the day after July 4th. They announced cancellation of the pipeline.
Hey.
And so my clients were the only clients along the route that did not have their property taken. And
Oh, wow.
um, so anyway, the next several years were spent unwinding that project.
Mhm,
But that speaks to there was a role of protest to slow it. There was a
mhm,
role of protest that results in education. It's a that sort of public speaking also plays a role in multi-party engagement, everybody doing what they can do, and then a lot of collaborative work. I could never say that what I did I was able to do alone. I would not have been able to do it, but for the other litigation that was going on.
mm,
Um, so just to that point, protest has a really important aspect to social change.
mm.
And I
Right.
will say that the folks that I worked with, they they did things that look like what you think of with a typical protest, people at
Mhm.
standing outside or having lots of signs in their yard.
Yeah.
There were signs everywhere that said no pipeline. But
Mhm.
they also did fun things like they would um, sponsor and encourage river paddles.
Oh,
So
wow.
people would get on canoes and paddle the river at the areas where the pipeline would be crossing, so people
Mm,
could see what the impacts would be. And so really inviting people to engage in what the impacts were going to look like in
mm.
ways that you couldn't see just from in front of a courthouse or, in
Yeah.
a public space. They were really challenging people to go out and see the environment that would be impacted. So I thought that was a really unique way to engage in
Oh my gosh, yeah.
protest and public engagement on the issue.
My last question for you today is, how are ways that we as youth can get more involved in the fight against environmental racism?
Um, I think I think the key phrase is
Mhm.
notice and name it. Um,
Mm,
be active in noticing what's going on. Um, when Ben Chavis defined environmental racism, he
mhm,
talked about a disproportionate exposure of communities of color and low-income populations to environmental hazards due to policies or practice that may be intentional or unintentional. And I think that's part of what environmental laws were supposed to try and address is those unintentional impacts. And I think it's really easy for all of us to not notice what's going on and be complicit unintentionally. And so I think the number one thing that youth can do, and we all can do, but I think youth are in some ways better attuned because
Mhm.
you've got a longer history in front of you and you've got higher stakes. Um,
Mhm.
and I think in some ways, um, you're you're not as calloused by what some of us may be. So you have a hopeful optimism and energy that will allow you to do that. But I think it's being attentive to and engaging in conversations with communities that you might not otherwise be engaged with, to listen to stories, to learn how other communities are connected with the land and water around them, and and to learn from those connections. Um, so I think it's like with little children, as you're beginning to develop language, the first step is noticing something on the sidewalk and giving it a name.
Mhm.
And so I think that's fundamental to everything that we do. Those are the first steps towards social change. Those are the first steps towards um, building a case for environmental law is kind
Mhm.
of, what are the facts? What are the things we have to notice here? And I think that's part of what the laws that were passed, NEPA in
Mhm.
particular, or the Superfund or TSCA, where you have to report and you have to know what's going on and what's being there. But all the reporting in the world isn't going to do any good unless people who care are
Mhm.
engaged enough to read it and and engage the communities that are impacted and figure out what to do with that data. So
Mhm.
that, in
Awesome.
some ways it's easy, but in a lot of ways
Mhm.
it's hard, and it takes a lot of persistence, and it's a marathon, not a sprint.
Yes.
So,
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for agreeing to meet with me. This was so helpful, and I'm really looking forward to this. I'm going to be writing an essay over this for my final project,
oh wow,
over an essay over environmental justice work and going more into detail. So this has given me so much material for that. So thank you so much,
cool,
um,
cool.
getting me a part of it.
I
Uh,
will also share with you, I have a new
mhm.
attorney that has come into my office who's
Mhm.
actually on the road to ordination as a Methodist pastor.
Oh,
So
wow, fun.
he also has a real keen sense for justice and what that
Mhm.
means. And so I asked him some of your same questions, and I think you'll get a
Oh,
kick out
yeah.
of his answers. So anyway, I'll forward that to you as well. But
Thank
good
you.
luck on your project. Good luck on life at TCU. And if I can ever be of assistance, please let me know. Go Frogs.
Of course, go frogs. Thank you.